I was 24 years old, so this is about 6 years ago, and I had started learning about the plastics issue relating to my work as a science journalist, because I've been covering issues relating to climate change, wildlife populations, and wildlife health and whatnot. But to head out into the Pacific Ocean to look at the issue of plastic pollution was not something that was immediately on my radar. But when I had the chance to cross the Pacific to look at plastic up close with science journalists and scientists, I was really excited. So heading out into the Pacific, it's this vast blue ocean. And as a journalist, I really like to put myself out there and see issues up close and firsthand, because I've seen in my experience that a lot is left out when you do not go to the source of the information. And so I've tried to make that my ethic. Jacques Cousteau inspired me with this quote. It's just definitely something I've taken on in my career and life. So I really went and saw for myself. I sailed more than 3,000 nautical miles from Los Angeles, California to Honolulu, Hawaii. And then after that point, also went to the Big Island of Hawaii to learn more about plastic pollution in that region. But it was really an eye-opening trip, because for years and years as a teen and in my early 20s, I'd increasingly heard of the issue of plastic pollution, like many of us had in the 90s and early 2000s. And to me, as someone who has worked with wildlife and was environmentally aware in the capacity I could be in that time, I was very worried, but I was also very confused, because why was all this trash ending up in this place very far away from people? As you can see, there are few islands out there, but a whole lot of water. And so I head out into the Pacific with this group called Plastic Change, which is from Denmark. And sailing under the Danish flag, we went out and collected samples of plastic from the water. And it was 24 days with no land in sight, very simple living on that ship. And I really got a taste of what it was like to be a sailor. I had 8 hours a day of sailing I had to do. It was a whole job. You had to have a shift where you cooked once every few days for 9 people, which is a very big task. But out there in this amazing blue expanse, there was a whole lot of plastic, but it was absolutely nothing like the media reports I had heard up to that time. So you might have heard this too, or read articles or heard stories, but the Great Pacific Garbage Patch was this area storied to be this floating island of garbage, or a garbage dump, twice the size of Texas. And I go there in 2016 and I see that it's absolutely nothing like that. And I'm going, how did the news get this so wrong? Because we would see plastic items float by in rapid succession. Sometimes there were big clumps of items, like this is a bunch of fishing nets that just found each other in the ocean, and we call this a ghost net. And so we did see a lot of big plastic stuff, but the bigger problem in the ocean, and by the way, we did pull out plastic stuff when we could access it, because it's an immediate danger to wildlife. You could imagine this large tangle of nets entrapping a turtle or a whale and causing damage, or even being a lethal catch. So we would be sailing and these plastic items would float by in the ocean current. That all tracks, that makes sense, because this garbage patch is forming. It is a high concentration of plastic coming from the coast of the North American region, and then also from Asia and the Pacific Islands and whatnot. But the bigger problem than just all of this plastic stuff coming out into sea, that's bad enough, right? But it's also breaking up into tiny pieces, because all the plastic all around us, especially plastic like this that has been in the ocean, starts to break up. It never breaks down or decomposes, but it breaks up into smaller and smaller pieces. And so not only do we have this major issue where we have large plastic items floating in the sea that could harm wildlife and people potentially, because these nets and ropes can catch in a boat. You could easily be injured by some of these plastics, but they're breaking up into tiny, tiny pieces. And we call these microplastics and nanoplastics, those nanoplastics being the smaller size range. And these plastics, as I'll explain a bit later, they are unfortunately all around us at pretty much all times, but in the oceans tend to really collect in large concentrations, because there is a lot of plastic kind of stored away in the ocean or traveling through the ocean at any given time. And a big reason for that is just that people use so much plastic, and plastic is very poorly managed, as I explained in my book and as I would learn later. But out at sea, first of all, I'm just finding out, okay, wow, this is not an island of garbage, this is a plastic soup. That was a really big realization, I think, at that time, challenged common understandings of the problem. And I'm really happy to see that journalists have actually turned the tide on this phrase. Instead of calling it a garbage patch, it's now most often referred to as a plastic soup, or the microplastic issue is emphasized in some way, which is really important. So microplastics today, and this is a brand new kind of field that is just being uncovered, but we've already found microplastics in human blood, in both sides of the human placenta, so both on like a maternal side and a fetal side of the placenta. We've found plastic in our organs and in human bodies. I mentioned in our blood, but also in our lungs, which is really dangerous because we can think about particles, and we know a lot about particle pollution. So say when we're outside and exposed to diesel exhaust, there's particulate matter made out of carbon in there that when it goes in our lungs can harm us and cause issues like asthma and sometimes cancers. And plastics is this new frontier because plastic is made out of fossil fuels, so it's very carbon heavy. And unfortunately, it also contains toxic chemicals. There are tens of thousands of toxic chemicals in plastic, a large amount, at least 2,400 of which have been deemed harmful to people, which is really scary because, again, this is all around us. But in the ocean, I've been on several of these expeditions, not just sailing with the Danish crew across the Pacific, but also I've sailed the Atlantic with an all-female crew. This was a global crew, and part of our mission as part of this group called X Expedition was to help people understand that, there's a chemical danger to plastic as well. It's not just this physical pollution that maybe hurts animals, but it's also this very chemically dangerous material that, especially to people who identify as female or have female-like hormones, or young people like children or babies, are super vulnerable because our bodies have a lot more hormonal activity, and young people in particular have developing brains and bodies. And so these chemicals tend to interfere with our hormones. They're called endocrine disruptors. So a few of the key ones are phthalates, bisphenols, and then there are other growing classes of plastic chemicals that are just starting to be understood, like PFAS, which are in the news lately because these chemicals in plastic not only pollute plastic itself, but also our bodies and the environment, and tend to stay a long time in the environment. So we were shedding light on that. Also, it was a really amazing thing to be a part of a project that highlighted women in science and women at sea, because these are fields that are predominantly male dominated. So that was, again, changing the narrative on who is understanding this problem and who is it affecting, and actually being a woman out on the ocean and understanding this substance is probably chemically harming me worse than other people potentially, and what are we going to do about it? But in the meantime, shedding light on it and doing research to understand more about it. So we measured plastic pollution not only in the water by pulling a trawl like we did on the other trip, but we also took microbial samples from the surface of the water, because it seems that a lot of pathogens actually stick to plastics, which, when we think about microplastics being in waterways, in our air, also in soils, this could be a possible route of disease transfer. And, we think about things like COVID and pathogens being in the air. Well, there are plastics in the air, and those pathogens love to stick to plastics. There was a study that showed that COVID-19 actually sticks better to plastic than to, say, cloth like cotton. So when you're thinking of going to the bag with a reusable bag, opt for those cloth fabrics that they're less likely to have those harmful viruses or bacteria stick to them in some cases. So that's something to keep an eye on as well. Again, here's more sampling of plastic at sea. So really understanding the full scope of this threat was, for me at first, when I started doing my research, which took about 5 years, the understanding at that time was, okay, this is a problem in the ocean. And it was unbelievable to be in the middle of something. As I just explained, now we know that there's microplastic in human bodies, in the air, in other waterways, and in the soil as well. There's even microplastic in outer space, which is unbelievable because it just shows you how far the human reach really goes. Oops, sorry, I went a little too far. As you can see, this is a fish egg actually on these tweezers. That looks an awful lot like a piece of microplastic. And we think about wildlife and plastic generally, but microplastic as well. And it has a variety of effects. And it's often to wildlife that we should be looking to kind of gauge the danger of these chemical threats on us. I mean, we've dealt with things like DDT, PCBs, and other toxic chemicals in the past. So there are pathways to dealing with problems like this. However, plastic is such a ingrained part of our life that it's, are we going to make the trade-off between preserving biodiversity and a wealth of animals and plants and keeping people healthy and the planet healthy? Or are we going to prioritize plastic and convenience and making money? Plastic harms not only animals, but people too. We are animals as well. So I always like to emphasize, we really need to pay attention to wildlife. I've been a wildlife rehabilitator for 15 years. I know a lot about the dangers to these animals, and it's really alarming. So one animal in particular I'd love to draw attention to are sea turtles. And not only are they choking on and, ingesting plastic, but they're also unfortunately dealing with reproductive issues because the sand on certain beaches is becoming so hot, not only because of climate change, but also because of plastic covering the beach. And so that's raising the temperature. And in my book, I include some results of a study and some quotes from scientists about this. But, an entirely covered beach gets a lot hotter than a beach that's made out of just sand. So if there's a lot of plastic on a beach, it'll retain more heat. And so sea turtle eggs hatch in a certain sex depending on the temperature. So if it's cooler, more males will hatch. If it's warmer, more females will hatch. And typically there's a mixture of both hatching at once because sands on beaches vary in temperature, and maybe the eggs are deeper or less deep, whatever. But unfortunately, sea turtles are becoming feminized, and unless they have a plan to still reproduce, and I'm saying that in a very facetious, sarcastic way, it's like we're going to see entirely feminized sea turtle populations that can't mate, that can't reproduce, and that's part of extinction. I mean, that's how extinction happens in real time. So unfortunately, we're creating a very hostile environment for ourselves and other creatures on this planet. Part of our mess. I have a lot of photos in here from my expeditions, but you can see how, we have plastic stuff. Pizza boxes have a coating on them. A lot of food packaging has plastic coating. Even some cans have plastic coatings, and we're not really made to be aware of that unless we seek out the information. And I say we as in, the general public. A lot of this stuff I did not know. And I've studied environmental science and whatnot in my college years, but it was unbelievable to see up close, this whole new field of science emerging, and being a part of the media to go along with that and deliver the information that we need. So again, I spoke about the sea turtles, but all different wildlife suffer when our beaches are covered with plastic. I've done kind of more in-depth studies too on plastic. I actually just had a paper come out this week in the journal Environments about plastic pollution in Iceland. So I did some research similarly to these other expeditions that you saw, but going to Iceland, which is a very far away place. I'm going to wait on that for a second. But to understand, actually what we're looking at. So in Iceland, we saw a lot of fishing line. So this is either polypropylene or polyethylene line that we would call monofilament, that kind of clearish or bluish looking plastic. And there was a lot of that specifically in areas where whales and other wildlife congregate. And that's really concerning, because if the plastic is kind of floating in masses of plankton or krill, you know, and then going to a fishing area where there are a lot of animals feeding and being caught, you know, the plastic is not only going into the animals' diets, but also into human diets that way. So it was very eye-opening to see like kind of this range of consequences up close. Very interesting, but also very scary, let's be honest. But not only does plastic pollute in its form of plastic, you know, microplastics and big pieces of plastic on beaches and whatnot, it's also the pollution that comes all across from the beginning of the pipeline, we call it, to the end of the pipe. So plastic never stops polluting. And even from the minute that its fossil fuel ingredients are extracted from the earth, it begins the polluting process, right? So unfortunately, plastic goes hand in hand with injustice. And this is another new, I don't want to call it a new development, but it's a new realization for the movement that widespread environmental injustice exists, not only with plastics, but with a whole plethora of other industries, but specifically in plastics and petrochemicals. But it's predominantly Black, Indigenous, and people of color, as well as rural and low-income communities that face the biggest effects of plastic pollution, and predominantly the effects at the beginning of the pipe and at the end of the pipe, where plastic is produced and then disposed, with serious consequences to mental and physical health. These images here I took when I went to Louisiana in 2020. So on the eve of the pandemic, I decided to go to so-called area called Cancer Alley, which is a really terrible name, but a name that really speaks truth to the amount of pollution present. So in an 85-mile stretch of the Mississippi River on both banks, there are more than 150 industrial polluting facilities, many of them refining petrochemicals, many of them producing plastics, and many of them violating environmental standards for pollution openly, and putting people at risk and cultures at risk as well. This is actually a picture of a landfill on Long Island. So I'm from Long Island, New York, and this is called the Brookhaven landfill. So islands have particular issues with trash for reasons that most people can guess. We run out of space very quickly. And being surrounded by water, there's no cheap or easy way to move trash elsewhere. And I just want to dispel the whole notion that trash can ever go away. Plastic and other trash is merely being pushed onto the shoulders of someone somewhere else when we put it in our trash bins. And often we do not know where our trash goes, and attempts to really understand it are met with either unsatisfactory answers or lies. So it's so hard, but it's so important to really understand what's happening when we put something in the trash or in a recycling bin. And so in my attempt to do this, I traced my trash from my local community to an incinerator in my local community, which sends toxic ash to another community, which is a primarily Black and Indigenous community elsewhere on Long Island. And so to see this toxic chain of events where this plastic affects many more people than meets the eye. And it's like, you know, it's the incinerator, it's the landfill, it's the transportation of the trash on the public roadways, which can pose a hazard and does pose hazards to other drivers and communities. It's the constant diesel truck traffic in my community and in this community in North Bellport. And so to see these effects up close and then connected to the plastic issue is something that has only recently really happened in full force. And the UN finally has discussed plastic pollution as a human rights issue, rightfully so, which is a really huge development and step in the right direction in finding solutions. So here's the ship in Iceland that I discussed earlier, and just bring it back to no matter where you go, there is plastic. This is in Myanmar, the Pacific Ocean again. And I like to like incorporate this into my presentations as well, because as much as plastic has kind of united us all in this very terrible way, I think never before has there been more awareness. And in my own experience, going sailing and heading out to sea, I really wanted to understand, why is this happening and how can we prevent, another plastic in the future and tackle this and go closer to solutions. And the biggest solution to me was really just living simply. And I talked to a lot of people who said, all over the world, who would say, oh, my grandmother used to do things this way, or my parents did things this way. And it was a great wealth of knowledge. So often talking to our elders and talking to people from other cultures can really lead to innovation and revolution that maybe is a lot simpler than we think that we need, but that we definitely need. I spent a month using a toilet as a bucket on a boat with no functioning shower, and I never had the richest experience. That was something in my life that I really cherish and I value. It was, living in a way that was in better harmony with the earth, with using what we had, and definitely really relying on teamwork and innovation in our own regard in a small scale. Because again, we're all united by these common goals or values, and minimizing our impact is definitely one of them. And being out at sea is just a big exercise in really like living in harmony with the planet, because you have few resources out there. You're really at the mercy of nature, and you need to work harmoniously, or else the nature will work against you, and you don't want that. So I always kind of try to focus on the idea of, if I'm looking at something that's plastic, or just something that I need, that I think I need, is it, do I really need this, or can I live without this thing? Because often we can say we can live without these things in many of these cases. So do we really want to preserve the beauty and the functionality of the planet, the balance that we need to survive, or are we going to keep pushing the planet to a tipping point? I mentioned the fact that plastics are made out of petrochemicals, but the idea that the climate crisis is upon us is extremely pressing, at this time as it was ever before. And to know that we need to address plastics to address climate is something else I just want to quickly emphasize. It's this looming issue that if we don't do something about it, so many more people will suffer, and people are suffering today. So it's about changing our mindset and kind of being able to embrace change. A big part of the plastics story is a story of misinformation, and also of industry control of the narrative. So plastics companies and petrochemical companies have long told people that, we have to stop littering, we have to do better about buying plastic stuff and recycling more. But when the truth of it is that only 5 to 6% of all plastics in the US have ever been recycled, and only 9% of plastics in all time have been recycled. That's a really sad number, and it really speaks to the failure of these industries to create a product that is actually healthy and useful. This is total opposite. This is a highly disposable, highly toxic material that does not work in harmony with people and the planet. And so putting that out there as another element of the story as well, and really realizing we have to correct this record is it's a big task and a big responsibility. I've taken it on in my life, but I find like a lot of pride when I see someone I know like telling someone else, like to see that chain of transfer of knowledge really happen in real time is a beautiful thing. And it's never too late to wake up to the truth of things, because we have been kept in the dark for so long. And the solutions are simple. They are not necessarily going to be simple to roll out in a world that is dominated by plastic in many ways. People often bring up, in medicine, for example, or life-saving applications, like when do we use plastic? What else could we use? And the fact is there are so many options out there, and a lot of them have to do with reuse and sanitization, refilling, sharing, and repairing. And then for cases where we can't get rid of the single-use type of application, say, for example, in the medical field, or maybe with certain types of packaging, can we make it 100% non-toxic and 100% biodegradable? So some really promising materials are algae and also mushrooms. I think those are two that will show a lot of promise. You think about packing peanuts, you could replace that with mushrooms, because mycelial foam is pretty spongy. It's completely biodegradable. It's non-toxic. It's probably even edible in most cases. Similarly with algae, the coalition that I work with now, Plastic Pollution Coalition, has a business member called Lollyware, and they create these algae-based straws out of the same equipment that was used to make plastic straws. So it's like, if we can replace plastic with, and again, truly non-toxic, truly biodegradable materials, because there's a whole nother conversation about greenwashing and bioplastics, which I have resources on if anyone's interested. But again, going back to what works, we have to focus on these values. I did mention mushrooms. I also mentioned algae. I forgot the slide was here, but here you go. You can enjoy me holding a ball kelp and some nice mushrooms from my garden. Right now, I would love to also bring up the idea that solutions are not just, again, about us having great ideas and using alternative materials. How do we actually shift the system? Well, right now with the UN talks closing, we have the INC1. So this is a new kind of grouping of talks that'll be unfolding over the next 4 years to address the UN mandated global plastics treaty. So this was like the first week's coming to an end today. And this is unprecedented. This has never been talked about before on this scale and of this level of seriousness. So focusing on the actual causes of plastic pollution, which are plastic production, as well as, government subsidization of fossil fuels, and the allowance of these industries to just maintain so much financial and political power, and really address these issues and address environmental injustice. How are we going to help communities that have been repeatedly poisoned by these industries? And how will these companies actually pay for maybe a cleanup of our existing environment, because it's totally saturated with microplastics at the moment. So these are big questions. This is just getting started, but by 2024, the UN has said we need an agreement. Excuse me. That's a very big development. So, excuse me for 1 second. Something went wrong with my computer. Anyway, if we can keep advocating for what we need, we are likely to make significant progress. But if the industry, again, takes over that narrative, we could be in big trouble. So there's a lot going on. There are so many groups spreading the word through advocacy, through cleanups, through other engagement. And then I just want to encourage each one of you to keep getting out there, keep exploring, keep seeing the world, because, right now we're at this turning point and a tipping point ecologically. And if you're at this conference, you're probably someone who cares about the planet, probably enjoys being outside. And just being out there and paying attention to the signs and paying attention to what's going on is super critical. And you might, discover something that's going on out there that can be really helpful to society, in a way to turn this all around. So that is my presentation. I'd love to take some questions if you have them. I'll turn the screen off. Apologies with my technical difficulties. Here we go. Stop share. Okay.
So Erica, I can start us off with a question from our Whova chat. And folks can feel free to raise their hands like Deborah is doing right now. So a question from Huba. Ricky Diamond is asking if you have any recommendations for allied organizations that are working on this. And yeah, ways to maybe get involved with them as well would be great.
Yeah, so again, I mentioned I'm part of Plastic Pollution Coalition. Let me try to get the link to our website in the chat for all of you. But this group is a global network, and we have more than, I think, 1,300 members all over the world at the moment. And there's a great little tab. It says our coalition on top of the, oops, I'm getting to the chat. Sorry about this, multitasking. So we have a tab that says our coalition. So if you click that, you can find groups local to you on a map, actually. So if you're in an area and you want to be involved physically in person, or if you're working regionally and you want to stay in that region, that's a great way to connect to other groups doing work locally. Deborah I think has a question.
Okay. Yeah. What, I mean, I'm just struck immediately by all the plastic that we use. I mean, I brush my teeth with a plastic toothbrush, and when I get my medication refilled, they don't refill it anymore. They give you a new plastic thing, and it's everywhere. And it's that's discouraging that in my life I don't really know, you know, I can't get to plastic zero. But can you talk about how much lifestyle changes are possible, and what sorts of major shifts do we have to look at to solve this problem? Or is it enough to just do what we can do individually?
That's a great question. And I always encourage people to take individual action, in the sense that we are making a difference, and collectively, if enough people catch on, we can agitate for change. But we do also need the systems change at the same time, so that your medication, when it is refilled, is actually refilled, and not just here's a new container. Or when we go to the store, there's access to refillable, you know, food canisters, so we can bring our own bags or our own containers and refill in that sense. So it is about, you know, making the changes in our lives, and there are a lot of things that we can do by, you know, either collecting stuff that helps us get in these habits of reusing, repairing, sharing, and refilling, or if we, you know, push our local and state and national and hopefully international governing bodies to implement real solutions. So it's a mixture of these things, but you'll definitely reduce your plastic exposure if you reduce plastic in your day-to-day.
But what are the major meta changes that somebody could, what are some worldwide changes of these conferences? I mean, what kinds of things are they looking at to solve the problems beyond the individual?
Great question. So we would have to implement like larger systems. Like maybe there's a return system for glass that gets kind of developed. So instead of having plastic packaging, anything that needs packaging maybe would be in glass or in clay. And this would have to be different depending on where people live, because there are different resources in different regions and like different local needs. But for example, in Thailand, I know local organizations have actually convinced grocery stores to go back to wrapping certain produce and foods in banana leaves, which are fully compostable and non-toxic. So it's like really based on where you live and what the culture is. And I don't want to say going back to the old ways, but in many cases, yes, like perhaps we have people who have soda refills, and there are, you know, multiple use things like SodaStream that replace a single use beverage that we can do in our day-to-day lives. But to imagine those refill, reuse things, but on much larger scales, that's kind of what we're looking at. And then also accountability by holding those companies and governments accountable.
I don't want to, just one more thing, and then I won't say anymore.
No worries.
But I mean, I did this thing about rinsing out my plastic bags and recycling them. But then I worked in a manufacturing plant, and they throw away more in industry. They throw away more plastic in 1 hour than I would do in a whole lifetime.
Right.
And I think the military does this too. They use a lot, and certainly there's things that use way more than I would do individually. But the big collective corporations and military, I know they dwarf anything that I could do.
For sure. And that's why we need that wider shift as well, because even if we're very well intentioned, our impact is small. And I know I'm sensitive to time. Thank you so much for your questions. I see that Heather has a question with your hand up. I think that might be the last question because we're running it a little low, but got it. Heather, whenever you're ready. I don't know.
Okay, sorry, I didn't know
worries.
if you called me. Hi, Erica. Thank you for your presentation. It was really good. I had a question. I've tried to kind of get away from plastic as much as I can, and like washing clothes in the plastic containers. I then switched to a company called Drops, which is like a little packet, and then found out that might not necessarily be great either because there's plastic in those. And then now changed to a company called Blue Land, which is like another type of form of harder material that you just put in. But I was just curious, I don't really know that much about those things that you, like the packets that you put into your washer and that type of plastic. Could you explain? I don't know, you just have like 2 minutes, I think, but that type of plastic that is in those Drops or Tide packets?
Sure. No, that's a great question. And it's directly related to a campaign that we're doing at PPC with Blue Land, the company that you just mentioned, which is really interesting because so when most people see these plastic pods, they've been advertised as eco-friendly by the companies that sell them. And, they do seem to dissolve in water. And I just shared the link if anyone wants to read more about PVA, but polyvinyl alcohol is the type of plastic that's used to make these pods and sheets. And they do appear to break up in water, but think about stirring, like say salt or sugar in water. Just because you don't see it doesn't mean if you taste it, it's not there. And we are calling it Plastic Pollution Coalition. That's when I say we are just calling for the EPA to do more research, because it seems that, if you're reading if you're reading industry studies and you're looking at their messaging, they're really selling this as a very eco-friendly plastic, but from everything we know about plastic, there's no way that it can be eco-friendly. So I'll leave it at that because I know we have 1 minute, but that link is really great if you'd like to learn more about it. Yeah, thank you all for being here too. I want to say that before we get cut off, and thank you for WFAN as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Erica, for this session. And it has actually not left me with the existential dread as much as plastic conversations usually do. I just really appreciate the work that you're doing. We had one more question come up in the chat, and I wonder if it's a good place to just end. But Denise O'Brien was curious about what keeps you from getting discouraged in this work, as it can feel like we talked with Deborah, like your impact is just one person. Like what do you do to keep from getting discouraged?
Oh, good question. I do what I love. So I spend a lot of time outside with my dog, and I go mushroom hunting and go for hikes, and that makes me really happy. And just knowing that none of us can do everything, but everyone can do something. Yeah. Thanks again, all.
Oh, I think that's a wonderful place to leave us off. Thank you so much, Erica. And Erica's book, Thicker Than Water, The Quest for Solutions to the Plastic Crisis, I think there's a little bit more information about it in the Whova session, and I can also drop a link to the articles that were mentioned in the chat, in the Whova chat too. So that won't go away when we leave this Zoom. But thank you all for joining us. We'll sign off here, and we'll see you in another session, I hope.
Thank you,
Erica. Take care.